guys for watching my YouTube channel. Of course, you need to subscribe, seriously, because this is a fun channel and it gives you some stuff to think about, food for thought, and helps encourage you in your walk with God. We're continuing our series on unconventional thinking, running against the grain. And the person that we're looking at in this series, his name is Jonathan. Jonathan was the son of Saul, the first king of Israel. And Jonathan, he kind of personifies this unconventional thinking. The first time we looked at him, he was fighting against the Philistines, and there was two of him and his buddy, and they dispelled a garrison of 20 Philistine soldiers. And this is what Jonathan said: God can save by many or by few. Conventional thinking says you have to have proportional numbers to have a conflict, a fighting chance. But Jonathan didn't go with conventional thinking. And then we talked about the friendship with David and Jonathan last week. And I believe that Jonathan was attracted to David's unconventional thinking. The first time we see David with Jonathan is after David beats Goliath, the huge Philistine giant. And I appreciate that David's very unconventional in his thinking. You know, he's like, I don't care who you are. How dare you defy the armies of the living God? And I think Jonathan was like, yeah, that's my man. That's exactly right. And they had this great, great friendship that they struck up and held fast on that friendship for many years. But I want us to think for Jonathan today, I want us to look at 1 Samuel chapter 20. Because in this chapter, we see this friendship with David. Jonathan and David are friends, and they make a covenant, and they're like basically going to be best friends. And when they make this covenant, and you see this covenant play out, even after Jonathan is dead, because David looks after Jonathan's son who gets hurt. That's a different rabbit trail, but I want you to think about Jonathan and his friendship with David, because I find this fascinating. In chapter 20, they're talking to each other, and at this point, Jonathan's dad, Saul, was super irrationally violent, aggressive, and combative against David. He was throwing spears at him, trying to pin him against the wall, trying to kill David, trying to do all this stuff. And Saul was absolutely threatened by David. And it's interesting because Jonathan is Saul's son. And he's got the family alignment with his dad, but he's got a covenant alignment with David. And it's interesting because Saul, who was anointed to be king by Samuel, God had deselected, in essence, Saul. And God had rejected Saul and had chosen David to replace Saul. But Jonathan, in the mix of all this, he doesn't get threatened by his friend David. In fact, he stays loyal to his friendship, even when it runs against his own dad. And I think this is really interesting because Jonathan recognized, and he says it in chapter 20, I know that what my dad is saying, and I know that my dad's behavior is completely wrong. It's against God. It's unrighteous. It's unjust. And I'm not in favor of my dad. I'm not in favor of the decisions that he's making. I know, and he tells David this, I know that you will be king, and I'll come alongside you and be a support and strength to you. I'll never undermine or undercut you. I got your back, David. I'm your best friend. And Jonathan, I think it's really interesting. He was very unconventional in his thinking, not only in his faith in God, but instead of aligning with his dad and choosing that irrational and that violent mantra and really, you know, family blood over anything, Jonathan doesn't do that. He says, that's wrong. And what my dad is saying is wrong. And I don't agree with him. And it's unjust and it's not godly. But I do agree with you, David. And that's very unconventional. And it's important for us to think about this because sometimes our family relationships can really make us question and can really put in front of us, are we going to stay aligned with God and what God says and God's word and God's plans and purposes and God's values and priorities, or are we going to pick up the family stuff? Because sometimes they don't agree. It's nice when they do. It's nice when they're mutually reinforcing. But if we have to make a choice between agreeing with our family and disagreeing with God, the unconventional is to disagree with your family and to agree with God. And that's the decision that Jonathan makes. He makes that decision, and it's not like he leaves his dad, which I think is all the more unconventional. Because conventional thinking is like all or nothing. I'm all in with my dad or I'm all in with David. And it's interesting that Jonathan walks a fine line, a very narrow path on his loyalty and his love, respect for his dad, but also being supportive of David and recognizing that God has anointed David to be the king, and God has picked David. That's the future. I'm not the future. Jonathan recognized that. I'm not the future. David's the future, and I'm in alignment with that. I'm in support of that. And I don't find that to be personally threatening or doesn't undermine me or make me unsettled or insecure. I'm totally on board with God's plans and purposes. And I just encourage you today, when I watch Jonathan, I think he gives us a really interesting example of unconventional living. Not just unconventional thinking, but unconventional living. And I just challenge you today, let's keep our eyes on Jesus. Let's be a little bit like Jonathan, that we're loving and respectful with our family, and we appreciate who they are, but we're still lined up with God's plans and purposes when they disagree with our family and the family mindset, family values, or family traditions and history. And I like that Jonathan did that. He was respectful with his dad, and he honored his dad, but his heart was aligned with God's plans and purposes. And that's unconventional. That runs against the grain. And I just encourage you today, Jonathan gives us a great example on doing that and what that looks like, and really walking in that example and saying, okay, God, I believe in you. I'm aligned with you. I'm after your plans and purposes, even when they disagree with my family or conventional thinking around me. So thank you again and again for watching. And maybe this is a question you could think about. If you think about God's plans and purposes in your life, can you think what's one area that seems in your life a little unconventional? And it might even be a question. I don't understand, God, what you're doing here or why this happened. But what would be one area? Maybe it's in your education. It's unconventional. My education, or maybe it's kind of in your church selection. Maybe it's in something that you find really appealing in the Bible. What is one area in your life that is unconventional? All right. So, of course, thanks for doing the notifications, right? Because you want to keep getting the updates on when we post. And here's the deal, your fantastic joke for the week. What type of music do windmills like? They are big metal fans. Windmills, big metal fans. Oh my gosh. So I'm telling you, next week's joke will be maybe, probably not, the best ever. Thanks. Have a great week. Catch you later.